The year was 1244, when Jerusalem once again slipped from Christian hands, falling to Muslim control in a storm of fear and fire that reverberated across Christendom. Pilgrims whispered of desecrated shrines, merchants carried tales of humiliation, and priests thundered from pulpits that the Holy Sepulchre, the very tomb of Christ, lay once more under the banner of the Crescent. Yet the world was no longer the same as it had been in the days of the First Crusade. The great kings of Europe were more enmeshed in their own dynastic feuds, the papacy was strained by politics in Italy, and the zeal that had once driven thousands barefoot to Jerusalem was tempered by centuries of disappointment. Still, there was one monarch whose heart burned with the old fire, a king who believed his destiny was to reclaim the Holy Land for Christ. His name was Louis IX of France, a man who would be remembered both as a saint and as a prisoner. Louis was unlike most kings of his time. Deeply pious, he lived with a severity that shocked his courtiers. He fasted. He wore hair shirts beneath his royal robes, and he insisted that his authority was a sacred duty rather than a license for pleasure. He saw the monarchy as a vessel for God's will on earth, and when news of Jerusalem's loss reached him, he resolved not merely to lament but to act. He would take the cross, he would lead an army, and he would prove himself not just the ruler of France, but the champion of Christendom. Yet unlike other crusaders, Louis did not envision a reckless march straight to the walls of Jerusalem. His eyes turned south to Egypt, the powerhouse of the Muslim world, whose control over the Nile and the Red Sea gave it the wealth and resources to dominate the Levant. If Egypt could be broken, Louis reasoned, Jerusalem could be reclaimed. It was a bold plan, one that would demand immense preparation and faith. For 4 long years, Louis built his crusade. Taxes were levied across France, ships commissioned, armor forged, preachers fanned out through the towns and villages, summoning knights and peasants alike to the holy cause. The papacy blessed his endeavor, seeing in Louis a model Christian king who might succeed where others had failed. And in 1248, at the port of Aigues-Mortes, Louis and his vast host gathered to embark. Chroniclers marveled at the spectacle. Banners bearing the fleur-de-lis snapping in the wind, the clatter of hooves on the wharves, the prayers of thousands who believed they were embarking on a sacred destiny. The sea, however, would be their first trial. Storms scattered the fleet, hunger gnawed at the men, and months of delay tested their resolve. But by June of 1249, the Armada appeared off the coast of Egypt, bearing down upon the city of Damietta, the gateway to the Nile. The defenders of Damietta were unprepared for the ferocity of the French landing. Through the surf and arrows, Louis himself leapt into the water, wading ashore with sword raised high. His courage electrified his men, and in a matter of hours, Damietta fell. The Crusaders could scarcely believe their fortune. Here was a prize that had eluded the Fifth Crusade decades earlier, one with astonishing speed. Supplies, fortifications, and a foothold in Egypt now belonged to them. Louis saw this as divine confirmation that his course was righteous, that God smiled upon his holy war. The army erupted in jubilation, and the French king marched triumphantly into the city, already envisioning the conquest of Cairo and the liberation of Jerusalem beyond. But success bred arrogance. The Crusaders lingered in Damietta for months, basking in their triumph rather than striking swiftly at the heart of Egypt. The summer heat turned their camps into swamps of disease, their supply lines frayed, and the discipline of the host withered. Meanwhile, the Sultan of Egypt, as Salih Ayub, rallied his forces and fortified the approaches to Cairo. When the Crusaders finally advanced up the Nile, the moment of surprise had long passed. Every mile was contested, every canal a barrier, every village a fortress. Still, Louis pressed on, determined to seize Cairo and break Egypt's spine. His faith was unshakable, but the realities of Egyptian warfare soon bled away the illusions of victory. The march toward Cairo culminated at the town of Mansoura, where the Nile split into treacherous channels and swamps. The Egyptians had fortified the town with barricades and hidden their troops among the narrow streets. Here the Crusaders would learn that courage alone was not enough. In February 1250, Louis's brother Robert of Artois led a reckless charge across a causeway, bursting into Mansoura with a contingent of knights. At first the Muslims reeled, and Robert's men exulted in their apparent triumph, but the narrow streets became their tomb. From rooftops and alleys, Egyptian troops poured down missiles and struck with ferocious precision. The Mamluks, the Sultan's slave soldier elite, sealed the exits and annihilated the Crusaders. Robert of Artois was cut down, his knights slaughtered, and the French advance collapsed into chaos. Louis, arriving too late to save them, could only watch as the cream of his army was destroyed. What followed was a grinding stalemate along the Nile, with disease and starvation proving deadlier than any sword. The Nile's floods cut off supplies, dysentery swept the camps, and the once proud army of Christ shriveled in misery. Chroniclers describe men eating horseflesh, knights collapsing in their armor, and the stench of death choking the riverbanks. Louis, however, remained resolute. He tended to the sick, prayed with the dying, and refused to abandon the cause. His piety inspired admiration, but his obstinacy also doomed his men. As the weeks dragged on, the Egyptians pressed their advantage, launching raids that further weakened the Crusaders. By spring, the French host was broken, its dream of Cairo drowned in blood and sickness. In April 1250, the Crusaders attempted a desperate retreat toward Damietta. It was a march of misery, the remnants of the once great army staggering through mud and enemy fire. Along the way, Louis himself was struck down by dysentery, his body racked with fever. At Fariscourt, the retreat collapsed entirely. The Egyptians surrounded the Crusaders, and Louis, too weak to fight, was taken prisoner. A king of France, descendant of Charlemagne, lay in the custody of the Mamluks. Never before had such a calamity struck Christendom. The news spread like wildfire, shaking the courts of Europe and filling pulpits with lamentation. The Holy War had ended not in triumph, but in captivity and humiliation. The Egyptians demanded an enormous ransom for Louis' release, vast sums of silver, and the return of Damietta. The French barons, desperate to save their king, scraped together the treasure, while the Queen, Margaret of Provence, steeled herself in Damietta, organizing its defense and negotiating with the enemy. Against all odds, she preserved the city until the ransom was delivered. In May 1250, Louis was freed, his body broken but his spirit unyielding. Most kings would have returned home immediately, but Louis chose otherwise. He remained in the east for 4 more years, stationed in Acre, working tirelessly to fortify the remaining Crusader strongholds, negotiate alliances with the Mongols, and provide aid to the shattered Latin states. Though his grand design had collapsed, he refused to abandon the cause entirely. In this persistence, he revealed the depth of his conviction, though history would judge it as stubborn futility. The Seventh Crusade ended in 1254, when Louis finally returned to France. The treasury was drained, thousands of lives had been lost, and nothing of Jerusalem was regained. To many, it was a colossal failure, a warning that the age of great crusading victories was over. Yet Louis himself was undaunted. He would later attempt another crusade, the Eighth, only to meet his end in Tunis. His legacy, however, would be shaped less by his military failures than by his sanctity. In time, he would be canonized as Saint Louis, remembered as a king who strove with absolute sincerity to live and die for his faith, even if his efforts brought more ruin than redemption. The story of the Seventh Crusade is a tale of faith colliding with reality, of a king whose vision soared higher than his armies could carry him. It is the story of Damietta's triumph and Mansura's slaughter, of a monarch who leapt into battle with the cross upon his chest, only to end his journey in chains. It is a reminder that the age of crusades, so often romanticized in memory, was written in blood, disease, and the stubborn dreams of men who believed themselves chosen by God. And as the Nile flowed on, indifferent to the agony on its banks, the world moved forward, leaving behind another chapter in the long, tragic saga of holy war. And so the Seventh Crusade stands as one of the great paradoxes of medieval history, remembered not for victory but for the spectacle of a king undone by his own faith. Louis IX entered Egypt with the conviction of a saint, certain that God's favor would deliver triumph, yet he left in chains, forced to ransom both his crown and his cause. His failure marked not only the end of his dream of reclaiming Jerusalem, but also the fading of the crusading spirit that had once consumed Christendom. What began in a blaze of zeal at Damietta dissolved into fever, defeat, and captivity along the Nile. And yet in this ruin, Louis found a kind of immortality, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of unshaken devotion. Canonized as St. Louis, his legacy carved not on the battlefields of Egypt, but in the memory of faith itself. The Seventh Crusade reminds us that history is not always written by victors, but often by those whose failures illuminate the limits of human ambition. It is the story of a holy war without triumph, of a king whose crown could not shield him from the weight of destiny, and of a world where even the most devout resolve could not bend the course of events. And as the sun set on that age of crusades, the Nile still flowed, eternal and unmoved, carrying with it the echoes of prayers, the clash of swords, and the fading dreams of men who sought heaven through war.